The robbery of the century is underway. The target is the hundreds of billions of dollars in America's public and private pension funds. The victims are millions of working and retired Americans who put their trust in the boards which oversee the funds. Some of the thieves are well known, such as Michael Milken of Drexel Burnham Lambert, now serving 10 years in federal prison as a result of a plea bargain, or Ivan Bosky, who made hundreds of millions in fraudulent schemes cooked up with Milken. But many others are still at large, still grabbing funds and conniving for more. These include elected officials such as Skip Humphrey, the Attorney General of Minnesota, powerful Wall Street firms like Skadden Arps, and lesser-known figures such as Henry Kravis, George Roberts, and Meshulam Riklis, many with direct links to organized crime. Many of them are also close allies and supporters of President George Bush. Few of these working and retired Americans who are being victimized are aware that their futures are being placed at risk by this thievery. As the George Herbert Hoover Bush depression deepens, desperate members of the U.S. financial elite, the friends and backers of Bush, are looting any source of funds they can find to back up their worthless, speculative paper. To them, America's pension funds are an inviting target indeed. In the next hour, we will examine who is looting America's pension funds and what you can do to stop it.
In the summer of 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan virtually certain, Lyndon LaRouche wrote a book called The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman. And in this book, he warned that the future well-being of our nation is threatened by what he called a monstrous hoax. The hoax that he defined was the policies of Milton Friedman and the fact that Milton Friedman, who was a University of Chicago economist who had become a very prominent advisor to several administrations, that Friedman was believed to be a conservative economist, and that Friedman was believed to be someone who had a policy, an economic outlook, that could lead to economic growth and a boom in the United States. And what LaRouche said is that Friedman's policies will destroy this country. And in the book, he wrote in the introduction that Americans have two options. Either we will destroy the hoax, or the hoax will destroy us. The events of the 1980s, in which Friedman's policies were adopted in the United States, have proven that, once again, LaRouche was right, that the hoax was not destroyed. Reagan came riding in on this white horse in which he promised that he was going to get the government off our backs, that he was going to deregulate, that he was going to open up the economy, that he was going to give equality of opportunity to all people. And now, as we head into the 1990s, we see that, in fact, the result of this is not a great utopia, that we're not moving toward a moment of grand American economic development, or a pinnacle, as George Bush might say, of American economy, that in fact the United States is heading into a depression. It's a world depression. Bush's New World Order is an attempt to save the bloated, indebted U.S. economy by looting from third world nations, from the Middle Eastern nations, from the former Soviet Union, to prop up hundreds of billions of dollars, in fact trillions of dollars, of bad debt, of bad paper, that grew up as a result of his friends in the financial community wrecking the U.S. productive economy. And what they're doing today is not merely trying to sustain that debt bubble on the backs of people in the third world. In fact, their policies have virtually wiped out whole nations in black Africa. Their policies are Africanizing Latin America today, where diseases are spreading throughout the third world that didn't exist for 50 years, 100 years. They'd been wiped out. They've now come back. But it's not just the third world. The third world has been destroyed. But they're now bringing these policies home. And we saw Bush in his State of the Union address the other night trying to save his presidential campaign, making a few promises, throwing out a lot of rhetoric. But underneath it is this deep fear in Bush and the New York bankers, the Anglo-American financial community, that they will not be able to sustain their banks, their power, unless they can get you to accept significant cutbacks, whether through increased taxes or increased budget cuts or a combination of both. And as LaRouche pointed out today, in a response to Bush's State of the Union address, there's no way that Bush's approach will do anything but cause more misery. If you cut the budget further, you cause great suffering to people whose programs, whose necessary programs will be canceled. But furthermore, as you cut back the budget, you take away jobs, which means the government has to pay more to replace or to take care of those people who have lost jobs. And what happens if you raise taxes significantly? Well, if you do that, you're going to put more and more businesses out of work. More and more people will have less money to spend. And what you'll tend to do is create a much bigger underground economy, as you have today in Russia, where people will go off budget and will engage in prostitution, drugs, and other such activities to try and stay alive. There's no way, short of the LaRouche approach, which is to establish through monetary policy, through an economic policy based on credit issued by the government for infrastructure development, and secondly, through the private banks to create new jobs and industry. There's no way other than that, by putting more people to work in productive jobs, that you can solve this problem. But Bush has no intention of doing that. In fact, if you look at the sorry characters who were running as Democratic opponents to Bush, that with the exception of LaRouche, there is no one in the Democratic Party who is changing the rules. That is, they may say something a little bit different than Bush, but their policies are basically the same as Bush. Because at the top of our country, at the top of government, you have a small group of financial elite that can work very well in either party. And some of these elite, they're not abstract names, they're not non-existent people, they're real people. Those people such as the Harrimans. Bush is a Harrimanite Republican. The Rockefeller interests in the Republican Party. And you find that the Harrimans also are very prominent in the Democratic Party. Now, what has this crowd done during the 1980s? How is it that we can say today that they have already stolen billions of dollars? And if they're not stopped, they'll steal everything else they can get. Well, right now, there is an ongoing theft of pension money, of money that's been placed in state government funds, in city funds, and also in private funds, that's being used to prop up this debt bubble. And as LaRouche identified, it all goes back to Milton Friedman. So to understand this, we have to start with Milton Friedman and the University of Chicago, which is where Friedman teaches, and his ideas are associated with what's broadly known as University of Chicago School monetary theory. Now, some of you may be saying, ugh, economics. What's the point of this? We're going to get history and an economics lecture. How are we going to learn anything from this? Well, part of what's been done to the American people is that they've been brainwashed to think that unless you have a degree at Harvard, Columbia, Yale, University of Chicago, unless you have a Phi Beta Kappa pin, unless you have a 27-piece suit and work on Wall Street or in a bank, then you couldn't possibly know anything about economics. And therefore, stay out of it and leave it to Bush and his advisors, most of whom have gone to Harvard, Yale, and I'm sure, as you've seen, most of them wear these 27-piece suits with their fraternity pins and their club ties and everything else. Now, what do they know about economics? They know one thing about economics, something they learned from the British, which is how to steal. That's what we've seen in the 80s, an institutionalized policy of theft. And it goes back most significantly in this last 12 years to the University of Chicago. So that's where we should start. Think of this as detective work. We're trying to uncover the source of a crime. And a major part of the crime, as you'll see, is that almost every single person in this country has been brainwashed by this group into believing their brand of economics. Get the government out of everything, free enterprise, free trade. And what I will start by telling you is that when they say free trade or free enterprise, just as the British did, who ran the global slave trade, who set up the global drug trafficking, just as the British did, when they say free trade, they mean rule by the powerful. They mean looting. They mean cheap labor or slave labor. They mean using commodities and raw materials to build up their power. So we go to the founding of the University of Chicago in 1892. And what kind of institution was this? Well, the University of Chicago was founded by two groups of people. Or they brought together, I should say, two ideas. One was the economics from Vienna. Now, Vienna in the late 19th century was the center of the most degenerate oligarchy in Europe, the most degenerate aristocrats. It's out of Vienna, as you probably know, about 20-some years later, or 15 years later, that Adolf Hitler was promoting himself in the artistic community. Much of the garbage in modern art today, you know, when someone drops a tennis ball in a bucket of paint and hits it off the wall and then sells the marks on the wall, that comes out of Vienna. There's a group in Vienna today, the Vienna Blood School, as they call themselves, which is a group of so-called artists who practice Satanism through art. Including a guy who last year or 2 years ago took a helicopter up and dropped blood. We don't know whether it was blood or paint, but something red that looked like blood on a group of 25 friends down below who were naked. And this was called art, and it took place in Vienna. And this came out of the Vienna School in the 1880s and 90s. From Vienna, there were several economists, von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, who are the great godfathers of Milton Friedman. Basically, they are promoters of the European aristocracy, who have always opposed the idea of a republic. They've always opposed the idea of equality among all men, and instead have believed that if you're an aristocrat, you are better and more able to rule. That, by the way, is the same governing philosophy as that of George Bush, as we have demonstrated in recent series in New Federalist, where we've covered the true history of George Bush and shown the racist roots of his political and economic thinking. So that's Vienna. But what was the other side of the University of Chicago? It was Oxford. It was the monetarist school of Oxford University, which was the center of British colonial economics. At the end of the 19th century, the British were still reeling from the defeat they had in the Civil War. Very, very few Americans know the real story of this. And one of the things LaRouche is doing in his campaign is bringing this out, that the American Civil War was part of a global war, that the British and the French were backing the Confederacy. Why is that? Well, the two reasons. One is it was the British who set up the slave system that was in the Confederacy in the first place. For the British, for Adam Smith, for John Stuart Mill, for the philosophers of Britain, a human being is a commodity, just like a ball of cotton, just like a lump of coal. And if they can get that commodity cheaply by rousing them out of Africa, chaining them into a ship and bringing them over to the United States and working them for nothing, then they can make money on that. And as Adam Smith says, the essence of economics is to buy something cheap and sell it dear. That's the British school. And British gunboat diplomacy during the 1830s and 40s, when they forced opium down the throats of the Chinese, is part of the school. And so when there was a fight in the United States, what did the British want? They wanted to split the United States, to keep the South as a source of raw materials, cheap labor, slave labor, and a place to sell their finished products. And it was this school, this thinking, that was defeated when Alexander II of Russia threatened to use the Russian Navy against the British. And as LaRouche has been pointing out recently, the British, by 1862, realized they had to change their policies. They had to move to a different approach because they would not be able to win the Civil War. What they did was they killed Lincoln to make sure there would be no Reconstruction, that the North and South would stay apart, and that the South would continue to be punished rather than developed as Lincoln had wanted to do. But they needed to get their poison into the North. And so they set up the University of Chicago in 1892. What was one of the guiding principles of this university? It was British economics. They brought Viennese professors and British professors. And what they taught was that the American system was no good. That the only system of economics should be the British system. In fact, the first chairman of the economics department at the University of Chicago was a man who was a spokesman for something called the Cobden Clubs. Now, the Cobden Clubs in the United States were the organizations devoted to defeating the tariff policy of William McKinley, committed to British free trade, to have the United States be appendage of the British Empire. Now, who funded the University of Chicago? That's usually a good test to find out what they're thinking, what their policies are. Well, the guy who gave the most money to found the University of Chicago was John D. Rockefeller. One of the other people who provided a lot of money was a man named Marshall Field, from the Marshall Field family in Chicago. And a third man was Jacob Schiff. Now, Jacob Schiff was the central figure in what later became known as Our Crowd, which was the name given to the German-Jewish banking families in New York City. The families around Kuhn Loeb, around Lehman Brothers. These were families who were part of the Confederacy. These are families that dealt in commodities before they set up their investment banks and their stock brokerage firms. These were families loyal to Britain. And one of the key people connected to them, who was also important in setting up the Chicago School, was a man named Warburg. Their view was that the United States should go back to an alliance with Britain and go back to British economic policies. And so this is what came out of the Chicago School. Now, Warburg's important especially because Warburg and his friends were the people who introduced and imposed on the United States in 1913 something called the Federal Reserve System, which today continues to serve the interests of this New York Swiss banking elite, New York, London, Swiss banking elite. Now, this group has been around. They've had influence for years. From time to time, they go out of influence. But toward the end of Carter's administration, with the economy clearly still suffering, they saw their opportunity and they grabbed it. Starting in 1978, they took over some of the agencies. For example, a man named Alfred Kahn, known to the press later on as Genghis Khan for what he did to the airline industry, took over the Civil Aeronautics Board. And he was the one who drafted deregulation of the airlines. Have you tried flying lately? Have you looked at the prices? Have you looked at the service? Have you noticed that there are only a couple of airlines left? The idea behind deregulation is to increase competition, supposedly to improve efficiency and lower prices. In fact, Chicago School deregulation has always been, as has British deregulation, been an excuse for the strongest, most powerful companies or banks to drive out their competitors and establish a monopoly. We had in this country laws against that called antitrust laws. Laws that tried to maintain a level playing field so different companies could compete fairly. Now, this was destroyed by the Chicago School in the following way. They began deploying people into the bureaucracy. For example, the Department of Justice. There was a man who you may remember named Douglas Ginsburg. He was appointed by Reagan to the Supreme Court, but they pulled him out when they found out he'd been smoking pot up until the few months before. Well, who knows how long he continued to be smoking pot, but they pulled him out. Now, Ginsburg argued that all antitrust laws are bad. We should have no antitrust laws. In other words, the big guys should be allowed to take over the smaller firms or drive them out of business anytime they want. There should be no regulation to stop that. This also became the policy in the Securities and Exchange Commission under Ronald Reagan, where they appointed graduates from the University of Chicago to play the key role in enforcing these antitrust regulations. The classic case, you might say, of having the fox guard the chicken coop. What was their policy? Deregulate everything. No regulations, no regulatory institutions. Free the markets. Let them set their own rules. And they deregulated airlines, trucking, and banking, among others. And you know what happened when they deregulated the banking. You used to have a choice of banks in this country, and they actually used to make loans. You know, if you can remember far enough back, you used to be able to get loans in Texas to go out and build a business or run a farm. Today, you can't do it. You have to talk to some bureaucrat in Charlotte, North Carolina, or someone in New York City, and they'll probably tell you, we don't think it's profitable to make loans into Texas anymore. This Chicago crowd set out to destroy the regulatory agencies, and they succeeded. Now, supposedly, this would mean we would have more freedom in the economy, that any young person with an idea would be able to get credit and build a business. This is the theory in any case. What actually happened? Well, there were some new businesses started up. Some big businesses started up. For example, junk bonds. Now, how many of you had ever heard of junk bonds before the late 1970s? Probably none of you really heard of them until the last 5 or 6 years when they started going bad. What deregulation did is it basically allowed a whiz kid named Michael Milken, who's little more than a garden variety swindler. They used to call them snake oil salesmen and run them out of town. Instead, Milken got his picture on the front of Fortune magazine, Forbes magazine, Business Week. He was named ADL Man of the Year. Milken became the great hero, the entrepreneurial capitalist par excellence. Lionized by the Wall Street Journal, the epitome of Milton Friedman's free capitalist hero. Now, what was Milken doing? He was stealing. He was cheating. He was lying. He was parking funds from one company, putting them in another. How could he do this? Well, in 1981 and 82, the Securities and Exchange Commission started looking into what he was doing. They sent one lawyer out to their Los Angeles office to investigate what Milken was doing. And he came back after 6 months to Washington, and he said, I have a case against Milken. And they threw it out. They liked what Milken was doing, the Friedmanites did, because it looked like it was creating a lot of money flowing through the economy. Now, we are working on a hypothesis, which we are certain is true. And we know it's true because we wrote the book on this. That is, the hypothesis that a lot of the money that allowed Milken to get started came from international drug traffic. Now, here's the way it works. If you're involved in junk bonds, if you're involved in these kinds of highly speculative ventures or real estate speculation, for example, many of you know in Houston in the early 80s, sometimes a lot would sell for $10 million to one guy in the morning, and then a different bank would finance it in the afternoon for $20 million, and then someone else for $30 million later that night. that this went on all the time, called the land flip. Now, where did all this money come from? A lot of it came from drug trafficking. If you look at the people who worked with Michael Milken, what you'll find is that many of these people were individuals who initially put together their funds in relationship with a group of speculators who were tied to organized crime. Now, you've heard the name Meyer Lansky, or maybe you've heard the name Bugsy Siegel, because recently they've made a very popular movie trying to promote this guy, make him sound like a great guy. Or there's another movie, The Mobsters, where people who go see it end up cheering for these organized crime characters from the 1920s and 30s. Well, what happened with all the money they made from prohibition and gambling in Las Vegas and so on? Did it disappear? There's a new biography out about Lansky which said he was just an honest businessman who had died broke. Well, where did his money go? This guy ran the casinos in Havana. He helped set up Las Vegas. He had controlling interests of some Hollywood movie studios. Well, a lot of that money went into the pockets of people like Victor Posner, who was one of Milken's friends, who kept using that money to buy junk bonds, to take over insurance companies, and to take over a company called Sharon Steel. Posner is known to law enforcement officials as a dirty guy, as a crook. He's been investigated repeatedly by the Securities and Exchange Commission, but they never once got him on anything. There's another guy named Carl Lindner, who came from a company called United Fruit Company. Anyone know what United Fruit Company is known for? Banana republics, for one. United Fruit Company was a company that brought the bananas from Central America into New Orleans. And they also brought a lot of dope in with them. United Fruit Company was controlled by organized crime families, from Max Fisher, Henry Kissinger's good friend from Detroit, to Carl Lindner of Cincinnati, who used the money he made from this drug operation to buy himself an insurance company. One of the presidents of United Fruit, by the way, a man named Eli Black, jumped off a building in New York City, the 60-something floor of a building in New York City in the 1970s when United Fruit was being investigated. His son, Leon Black, became one of the leading junk bond salesmen for Michael Milken at Drexel Burnham. This is the crowd we're talking about. These are people, Ronald Perlman, Saul Steinberg. These are people who made tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars during the 1980s in the junk bond market, taking over companies, buying up firms, sweeping that drug money in there, mixing it up in it. And meanwhile, while LaRouche was calling for a war on drugs by going after these people, what was the Reagan administration doing? They're running around grabbing the guy on the street corner who is selling a couple of rocks of crack, while the bankers and the investment brokers who were laundering the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars were vacationing on the French Riviera, sitting in their Swiss chalets, donating money to the Bush campaign. Now, in the early 1980s, they figured, hey, this is pretty good. We're making a lot of money. What else can we do? And they started jacking up something which became huge during the 1980s, something called the leveraged buyout, which is basically a hostile takeover using debt and using other people's money to take over companies. In 1982, Michael Milken of Drexel Burnham, the junk bond king, got together with a man named Henry Kravis of a takeover firm called Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts. And they figured out, let's start using junk bonds so we can have more money to take over these companies. Billions of dollars. And the test case was one time when Milken had to raise $3 billion over 2 weeks. And he did it. He called his friends Posner and Lindner and Steinberg and Meshulam Riklis, a gangster who's close friends with Ariel Sharon, another gangster who's a powerful figure in Israel. And they proved they could raise the money and use it for takeovers. And Milken said, we can now go after any company in the country. We're going to make IBM and General Motors quake. As it turns out, General Motors certainly is quaking. IBM is laying off people, not because of what Milken did directly against them, but because of this system. Now, there were some people who started to say, is this good? Because what happens with a leveraged buyout? How do you pay all the debt that's created? Well, you shut down sections of the company. You lay off people. You stop spending on research and development. Eventually, you take away jobs. You destroy communities. Is this good for the economy? Of course not. Is it good for the takeover dealer? Is it good for the lawyers like Skadden Arps, who have among their lawyers leading people who were involved in drug trafficking like Kenneth Bialkin, the former chairman of the Anti-Defamation League, who committed that organization to go after LaRouche and try to destroy him? Sure, it was good for them. They were making lots of money. So they set up in 1983 a blue ribbon committee to investigate this. And who did they put on the committee? Did they put a steel worker who lost his job because of a takeover? Did they put an economics student, or did they put a short order cook who used to work for an auto company? No, they put all the takeover experts on the committee to decide if takeovers are good things. That's like putting a bunch of rapists on a committee to determine if there's sexual harassment in the workplace. And of course, their conclusion was, we can't find anything negative in the economy with hostile takeovers. In fact, we can say neither good nor bad things about them. Well, the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, who was pretty much a puppet of this crowd, a man named John Shadd, decided that he had seen enough. And so in 1984, in June 1984, he gave a speech called The Leveraging of America. And in this, it's the one time in this 12-year period from 1980 to 1992 that one person from this grouping spoke up against it. What Shadd said, and this is a quote from that speech, "In today's corporate world, Darwin's survival of the fittest has become acquire or be acquired. There is no logic to this," he said. "The more leveraged takeovers and buyouts today, the more bankruptcies tomorrow. The leveraging up of American enterprises will magnify the adverse consequences of the next recession." This is the one time, by the way, that a Reagan-Bush economist was right. He went on to say, contrary to discipline, because the argument of the LBO takeover guys is if you load a company up with debt, then the company will have to get leaner and meaner to pay off the debt. That's like someone who's unemployed saying, if I go out with my credit card and buy all kinds of things I don't need to help George Bush with a recovery, then it will help me manage my budget better later because I have to budget to pay off this debt. Well, what Shadd said about this is contrary to discipline. The increasing threat of being taken over is an inducement to curtail or defer research and development, plant rehabilitation and expansion, oil exploration and development, and other programs which entail current costs for long-term benefits. Companies that do not replace aging facilities and declining resources become increasingly inefficient. That is absolutely right. And as I said, it's one of the few times in this recent period that someone in the Reagan administration was right. Did they go with that? No, they threw it out the next day. No one paid attention to what Shadd said, and there was no change. So the economy was opened up. The looting game began by 1982-83. Now, to make a takeover, you still need money. You can't just go out and create debt. You have to have something there. So you needed large amounts of funds. In fact, during the 1980s, $1.5 trillion went into takeovers. That's money that could have put us on Mars. It could have provided food for every hungry child in Africa. It could have given us money to cure AIDS, cancer, and who knows what else. But instead, that went into takeovers. And $60 billion of that off the top went into the pockets of the deal makers, of Milken's friends, of the Ivan Boskis, the Kohlberg Kravis Roberts. Some of it went into the campaign committee funding of Bush, of Skip Humphrey in Minnesota, and others. But they needed that money. Where do you get $1.5 trillion? Well, because of banking deregulation, They could get it from the banks. They could get it from the savings and loans. And so the savings and loans started buying junk bonds, and they started investing directly in these LBOs, these leveraged buyouts. Milken got insurance companies to put money in. But even that wasn't enough. They needed more. And so in 1982, Henry Kravis's cousin, George Roberts, convinced the state of Oregon pension fund to put money into a leveraged buyout. Now, the state pension funds have over $1 trillion in them. Now, a pension fund is basically deferred payment. If you work for a city or a state agency or many private agencies, part of your salary is deferred. That is, it's put aside in a fund that's supposed to make money so that when you retire, there'll be money there. The idea is that if you work hard and put in a good life and help the company and help your community, that you're entitled to something when you retire. It's a similar principle as Social Security, except it works within government and private sector. Now, they have to make a certain amount of money. They're governed by something which says that you have to be responsible. Don't go for huge speculative investments. At least that's the way it used to be. After the 1980s, after 1982, when the state of Oregon agreed to put money in Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, what do you think happened with state pension funds? They said, why don't we get in on this? Why don't we make the big bucks? And they started putting teachers' pensions, the pensions of firemen, of policemen, into these buyouts. In 1987, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts had a fund of $5.6 billion, more than $3 billion of which came from these state funds, from Oregon and Washington, from Minnesota, New York State, Wisconsin, Utah, Iowa, Illinois, Montana, Michigan, and Massachusetts. Those 11 states gave $3 billion, which were used in the $26 billion takeover of RJR Nabisco. In that takeover, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts pocketed close to $300 million off the top, right at the very beginning, with another $500 million shortly after that. That is, they get the money from the state funds. They use it for the takeover, and then they take fees out of it for themselves. They paid themselves for conning a state body into giving them the money to use for this. Now, this became the big operation in the late 1980s. As I said, $1.5 trillion went into this. The firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts by themselves borrowed $56 billion. $56 billion from insurance companies, banks, and pension funds between 1976 and 1990. And they took over 30-some companies doing that. Now, when the states started doing this, their immediate response was, but it's going to give us a good return. Well, first of all, initially it might seem that way, but a good return at the expense of what? If you're a pimp running a prostitution ring, you get a good return. If you run a casino and you're the boss of the casino, you'll get a good return, but at what expense to the society? Is it the right thing for teachers and firemen to depend on these kinds of speculative gambles to see whether or not they're going to get their retirement funds? That's turning the whole economy into a giant casino. And in this case, the house is the buyout boys and the junk bond dealers from Wall Street. But secondly, as Shad said, what happens when you build up this leverage? Can you continue this profitability? In fact, recently we're seeing more and more bankruptcies due to junk bonds. Macy's, the great department store, just went bankrupt this last week. Siemens Furniture, Storer Communications, Zales Jewelers. These are all junk bond finance purchases. And if you had your money, if your pension was invested in Zales Jewelers, you might be lucky to get 24 to 30 cents on the dollar out of that. And if that's your retirement, then you should find out who invested that, who made that deal. Because there's some broker who probably got $2 for every dollar that was put in from your insurance company or your pension fund. Now, that's not the end of it. There's another side to what's happening to these state funds. As you know, states are going bankrupt. They don't have enough funds to cover their annual or their regular costs. So the states have money in these pension funds. And so what are the governors saying? The governors are saying, why should we let the state go bankrupt today to have money for these people who are retired or will retire in 10 or 20 years? We can always pay it back later. You've heard that before, right? We'll always put the money back in, but we need to borrow it now. So in California, Pete Wilson, who styled himself as a Reagan Republican, took $1.6 billion out of the California retirement system to use to pay down the budget deficit. In the state of Illinois, $21 million was taken by their Republican governor, Jim Edgar, even though the Illinois pension funds are grossly underfunded. In Texas, where we have an unfunded liability of $4 billion, that is, that $4 billion that will be necessary to pay for retirement pensions in the future is not there. They've tried to pass in Texas last year a bill, an amendment to the Texas Constitution, that would allow the state pension fund to be invested directly into real estate. Now I ask you, who in this state would be sucker enough to put money into Texas real estate right now? Obviously, no one in this room or no one who's watching this show would go out and sink a lot of money into these office buildings and houses which are continuing to depreciate. So what do? They say, since we can't convince individual investors, let's get a big state fund, the teachers' pension fund, and use money there to bail out Bush's bankrupt banks. And that's what they tried to do. And even though the voters of Texas voted it down in the 1991 on the amendment, it's going to come back again. You can be sure of that. In New York State, they did it a little differently. Instead of taking money out of the fund, the state just didn't put it into the fund. In New York State, they withheld $850 million over 2 years. And Mario Cuomo said, this is such a good idea. We should do this as a national policy. I've got news for you. Bush already did it. And he did it to support this idiot Phil Graham's Graham-Rudman bill. Remember what happened there? They said, we're going to get rid of the budget deficit by 1987, by 1988, by 1989, and so on and so forth. And of course, the budget deficit has grown and grown and grown. So what did they do? They said, well, let's take the funds from the Social Security. We'll raise the Social Security tax and put that into the budget deficit reduction. So what are they doing? They're stealing from the future to pay down the deficit today to make themselves look a little bit better, to make Phil Graham look less stupid, if that's possible. That's what they're trying to do. And they also did it with the highway funds. Now, I just had on Fondren the other day, I hit a pothole, huge pothole, and did a couple $100 damage to my car. To take money from roads and highway funds is dangerous. But to do it under the guise of being fiscally responsible is criminal. So what they did with the states, just to summarize this, is first of all, they take money from the pension funds. They convince the state you're going to get a good rate of return, this is good business. The old snake oil salesman. They get the money and they put it in these LBOs after stuffing it liberally in their pockets first. And then secondly, the states take some of the money themselves to pay down the debt, and they withhold the funds that are supposed to go in, which is a form of theft because that's a deferred wage. In other words, you earn that by doing your job. It's as though the state is saying, we're going to increase your taxes, but we're not going to tell you. And you won't find out about it until you retire, and suddenly you find that your check is about 1/4 what you thought it would be. Now, they've also done a couple other things with pensions. You've heard recently about Robert Maxwell, the British financier who was found polluting the ocean off the Azores or something. What did Maxwell do? Maxwell took over companies, and then he stole the pension fund to pay the debt that he incurred by taking over the company. And there's a funny story. The editors of one of his companies, the Daily Mirror, were thinking about how to write about his death. And they were talking about, well, look, some of these things are coming out that show financial corruption. Should we cover this in our paper? Should we report it? And so what did they do? They said, just one question. Was our pension stolen? And that changed the way they covered it. But this is typical. You take over a company, you can't make the payment, so what do? You steal from the pension fund. This was done by Ronald Perlman, who took over Revlon, who was one of Milken's monsters. This was done by Hurwitz, who took over Pacific Lumber. And he took over that company. He stole from the pension fund. And then they go back to Milken and they say, we don't have enough money for the takeover. What should we do? And Milken gets his friends in the savings and loans and the insurance company to buy junk bonds to give the takeover guy money to take over the company. Then they take over the company. How do they pay off the junk bonds? They steal from the pension fund. They cash out the pension fund. And then what do? After they get the pension fund, they buy annuities from the insurance company instead of pensions. So you no longer have a government-guaranteed pension. You're left with an insurance annuity, with a company that makes its money from junk bonds. And then what happens? Well, Executive Life went bankrupt. 84,000 people have pension or have insurance annuities with Executive Life, including all the employees of California Blue Cross, including all the employees of Charles Hurwitz Pacific Lumber. You know what that means that they have? They have zero. And Michael Milken still has that money, even though he's doing time for thievery. Milken in 1 year made $550 million salary and bonus. Over a 5-year period, he made over $1.2 billion. And what was his fine? $600 million, but he could use $400 million as a tax credit. How can you use a fine for thievery as a tax credit? Well, this is what's happened under Ronald Reagan and George Bush. They've shut down the factories after the takeovers. They've spun off the businesses. They've closed down research and development. They get credits so they don't have to pay taxes. When Ronald Perlman took over Revlon, he had a big tax liability. So what did he do? He agreed to take over 5 or 6 savings and loans in Texas that were bankrupt. In return, the government would take all the bad debt from those savings and loans and give him just the assets. Plus, they would give him a $900 million tax credit to cover what he would have had to pay for his takeover of Revlon. So how did he do? He did great. What happened to those savings and loans? They still went bankrupt, and you're paying for them, for those savings and loans. And Perlman is one of the guys who will tell you, Reaganomics has been good for me. I'm still bullish on George Bush. And the people who worked for Revlon, who had a pension fund, Perlman gave it to Milken to put in Executive Life. And when Executive Life went bankrupt, the pension fund holders at Revlon lost their annuities. This is what the great pension theft has been all about. We've had a period of 12 years. It actually, again, began under Jimmy Carter, because Carter was really just occupying the White House. You know, he probably thought it was neat to be in Washington and have a big house. But it was the same group of people, this Trilateral Commission crowd, this David Rockefeller, this Wall Street crowd that ran the policy. And when Carter became unpopular, they tossed him away like a used Kleenex. Ronald Reagan came in. He was going to do battle with them. He had the ideology of the Friedmanites, get the government off your back. And he got the government off the back of the junk bond dealers. He got the government off the back of the speculators. And he put the debt on our backs. And George Bush's friends, his long-term buddy, Henry Kravis. Bush and Kravis go back to Bush's father and Kravis's father. Prescott Bush, who was a banker for the Nazis, as we've documented in New Federalist in this series that we've done on the real biography of George Bush. Prescott Bush, George's father, and Ray Kravis, Henry's father, were such good friends that when George Bush got out of Yale and needed a job, Ray Kravis was going to find it for him. Instead, Bush went with Dresser Industries, and the rest, as they say, is history. Ray Kravis spawned Henry Kravis, who got together and built this Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts, and they've been looting the state pension funds. Kravis was involved with Michael Milken every step of the way after 1982. Milken's in jail. Where's Henry Kravis? He's sitting in his upstate New York country club, his Aspen, Colorado home, his New York City penthouse. He's worth almost $750 million. He owns RJR Nabisco. He's spinning that off to make money as fast as he can. Several of his companies recently, like Seaman Furniture, have gone bankrupt. People lost their jobs there. Kravis is still doing fine. He's a close friend of George Bush. In fact, he advises George Bush on corporate debt. And so if you're sitting out there thinking, that's a bad story, that sounds terrible, but not me, I'm okay, my pension's still good. Like a friend of mine who told me for years, I'm not worried, I'm with Pan American Airways, and this is the bedrock of the United States. I haven't seen him too much recently because I think he's probably out there checking to find out what happened to his pension. And it's gone because a judge ruled in New York that the pension is the last thing that's paid when you liquidate a company. And that means that 10,000 employees who were retired of Pan Am have been left with nothing but a few good memories and a very harsh future. The savings and loan, the insurance companies, Prudential Insurance this week, was downgraded by Moody's. So it all comes back to a very simple question. As LaRouche posed this in 1980, he said Friedman and Friedman's policies represent a monstrous hoax. Friedman and the ideas of Reagan and Bush are not the American system. They're the antithesis. They're the enemy of the American system. There's nothing in the Constitution, nothing in the history of our country, of the real America, the productive America of Alexander Hamilton, of Abraham Lincoln, and of Lyndon LaRouche, which allows a handful of financiers and bankers to loot the country, to shut down factories, to destroy infrastructure, and make money on it. That is the British system. And too many Americans got a little bit of money from Reagan, a little bit of extra money from their house being upvalued in real estate speculation. And so they said, oh, I don't like Ronald Reagan, but I'm doing okay, so it doesn't matter. And they heard Lyndon LaRouche's warnings, and they said, well, isn't he that extremist out there? I mean, he's saying that this is no good, and the Queen of England runs drugs, and this and that. And the media lied about LaRouche. The same media that told you how we're in a great economic recovery. Do you remember, month after month, Reagan would get up there, or he'd get Donald Regan, the thug from Merrill Lynch, or James Baker, when Baker, who made his fortune due to the Harriman family, Baker would come up and they'd say, this is the 56th straight month of the recovery. This is the 81st straight month of the recovery. And everyone you knew was either out of work or losing their house. Their banks were closing down, and you were told this is another month of the recovery. And George Bush recently said, well, I guess we aren't having the recovery that I thought was here. And then he came back with more of the same. And so a lot of people are saying, how could this have happened? How could we lose this? Well, a crime is being committed, and it's being committed against every single one of you. It's not bad. It's bad enough that we have a lying president and that we have a lying press. But the bad thing is that even as this is hitting every one of you, people are not yet drawing the proper conclusion. That is, that it's time to stand up and fight. Now, there's still a choice. There's still an option. LaRouche is running for president, even though he's in jail. And he's in jail precisely because he is fighting this operation. He's fighting these bankers. That's why he's in jail. But he's still running for president. They haven't shut him up. And the choice then falls on you. You have an opportunity to fight this. We've been doing our job. We've been finding out who these guys are, who the crooks are, how they're doing it. I just recently wrote a series in New Federalist, a 5-part series on the pension funds that's available for people to read so you can figure out how this is happening. But once it happens, if your house has been burgled 20 times, do you still leave the doors and windows open and a sign saying valuables inside, please come in? Well, if you vote for Bush, or if you vote for one of these puny-minded Democratic candidates who push Bush with compassion, they're not so different from George Bush, then you might as well stick a sign on your door saying, all thieves, rapists, and crooks, welcome. Because that's what's happened with our country. And it's the same people who are doing this here, who are destroying third world countries. The same people who are refusing to do anything about problems of hunger and disease in Africa, who are destroying the nations of Latin America, and who are looking to the people who finally, after years, overthrew communism. And they're saying, what do you have in your country that we can steal? Is it a coincidence that Bush chose Bob Strauss, a well-known, I shouldn't call him a thief, but a well-known character who traffics with this same crowd? That Bush sent Bob Strauss to Russia to check out the prime real estate and industries and raw materials? That's the problem we face. And if the American people have an ounce of morality left, it's time to put an end to this. And not just in this country. You can't just throw the bums out. You have to have an alternative. And that's where the LaRouche policy, based on the American system, comes in. I just came back from Germany and met with people from Africa, from Eastern Europe, and from all over Western Europe who are working to support the LaRouche campaign. And the question they ask repeatedly is, are the American people going to wake up? Do they realize what a wonderful patriot and potential leader they have, who they allowed to be thrown in jail by Kissinger and the like? Will they support LaRouche? And that's the question that's posed. It's not enough just to take down the sign that says, welcome burglars. The question is, are we going to create a true, just society here in this country? Will we take this opportunity now? Or will we let the country go to the dogs like Michael Milken and the rest of the crowd of these junk bond speculators and gamblers? That's the question that's posed to each and every one of you. And that's what I have to say tonight. Thank you.
The publications seen on this program that were founded at Lyndon LaRouche's instigation, EIR, New Federalist, and books too numerous to mention, have built an unrivaled reputation over the past 20 years for reporting the news behind the news that the ruling establishment would have preferred to keep secret. In 1978, the publication of the book Dope Incorporated first exposed how hundreds of billions of dirty drug dollars were being laundered through the most prestigious of the international banks. The book was specific. It named names of over 80 international banks. Needless to say, the leaders of these institutions were not very pleased. The book Hostage to Khomeini exposed a British intelligence, Israel, U.S. secret government apparatus that placed Khomeini in power. Later EIR articles showed the same apparatus involved in the October surprise negotiations that kept our hostages in Iran till after the 80 elections, and later employed in the Iran-Contra affair. 6 months before the October 87 and October 89 stock market crashes, New Federalist articles by LaRouche forecast those events. Over the next several months, a new unauthorized biography of George Bush is being serialized in New Federalist with explosive information about our president's past, including the documented fact that his father, Prescott Bush, financed Adolf Hitler. For information on how you can obtain this literature, please call the number that will appear on your screen.